So there was this lovely pool of water in Jerusalem where people would gather. And at the time of Jesus, it was a really popular place where those that were sick would gather together. And I guess its popularity stemmed from the miraculous healings that occurred there. Because you see, from time to time, the water moved unnaturally. Now, we're not told exactly what happened. Perhaps it bubbled or it swirled, but John's gospel tells us that an angel stirred up the water, and those that were blind or lame would race to enter the pool. And some of those that entered the water were healed. Now, John chapter 5 tells us that on a certain feast day, there was, when Jesus was in Jerusalem, that he was near this remarkable pool of water. And by the pool, there was a man who was paralyzed. And this paralyzed man had been that way for 38 years. And think about it, it's quite a sad situation. And what made it even sadder was that this man had no one to help him get in the water when the water was stirred up. He couldn't jump in himself because he was lame. And those that were blind, they could jump in, but he couldn't because he couldn't move. And he had no friends to help him. But on that day, this lame man was introduced to a healing power that was greater than the water that he sat beside. And so you can see there in this verse that Jesus says to this man, "Rise up, take up thy bed and walk." And immediately the man was made whole. And it must have been one of the most amazing days ever for this man. You can just picture those around, how happy they would have been for him, seeing this man that they might have known for many, many years. It would have been a happy moment for him, for those watching, for Jesus himself. There was just one little problem. And the problem is that this happened on the Sabbath. And Jesus had instructed this man to carry his bed. So what was a wonderful miracle was a travesty to the Jewish leaders. So the Jewish leaders come after the man that was healed, and they accost him because he's carrying his bed on the Sabbath day. And when they inquire of him how it happened, they want to know who did it. And when they learn that it was Jesus, well, we're told in a later verse in the chapter that they persecuted Jesus and they looked to slay him. They started to scheme to kill Jesus. And I think there's some irony to this statement that they're upset that a man is carrying his bed, and their solution would be that they wanted to find a way to murder Jesus. Well, what we want to highlight is that the Sabbath was a huge source of conflict between Jesus and the Jews. Over and over again, what Jesus did on the Sabbath upset the religious leaders. They didn't see eye to eye on what the Sabbath meant. And there's probably not a single thing that made them more angry than what Jesus did on the Sabbath. Now, on a previous occasion, Jesus said two things that I think would have really made the leaders' blood boil, as it were. So Jesus and his disciples, they're walking through a field of wheat, and they're hungry. So the disciples stop and they pluck some of the grains of wheat, and they rub them between their hands to release the kernels. But it's the Sabbath. And according to the Jewish leaders, the disciples were working. Now imagine the anger of the Jewish leaders when they talk to Jesus about this. And Jesus makes two statements. And just picture what they would think as Jesus said this. The first thing that Jesus says in Mark chapter 2 that we want to highlight is that Jesus says the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. And they saw it completely the opposite way, that man was supposed to follow a whole set of rules regarding what you could and couldn't do on the Sabbath day. But then I think what he said next would have made them even more angry. He said to them, the Son of Man, which is himself, is Lord also of the Sabbath. The heart of the issue is that Jesus and the Jews read the same Old Testament. They had the same scriptures. They had the same law. But why did they come to two different conclusions? So I guess we should step back and quickly look at the fundamentals of the Sabbath day from the Old Testament. What were the origins of the Sabbath day? Well, there's no doubt that the Sabbath day was an important part of God's commands. It couldn't help but be because it came up every seventh day. Every week there was a Sabbath. But beyond being frequent, even its origin is significant. So the Sabbath shows up here in Genesis chapter 2. So you're not even much more than a page into the Bible, and God delivers this principle of the Sabbath. And the principle is there in creation. So we find in Genesis chapter 2 that it talks about how God finished his work on the seventh day, and he rested on the seventh day from the work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy. So 6 busy days of creation, but on the seventh, God rested. And we know he didn't stop because he was tired. God doesn't get tired, but he stopped because that work of creation was finished. But more importantly, we're told that God rested because he's now going to take this seventh day and turn it into a teaching tool. He's going to teach us a principle. And that principle is going to be found throughout the entire Bible, all the way to the very last page. And the principle is about rest, but it's also about something else. You can see that when God blessed the day, he made it holy. That means to set it apart, to make it separate and different than all the other days. Now, days can be repetitive. So God wanted man to stop every seventh day and see things differently, and to make a day holy and set apart for him. Okay, so you've got this principle, shows up in Genesis chapter 2, right at the beginning of creation. But God then goes on to reinforce it in the most dramatic delivery that we have of scriptural principles in the entire Old Testament, which is when Moses goes up to Mount Sinai. God writes with his finger, inscribing into stone 10 commandments. And so in Deuteronomy chapter 5, in one of the descriptions of the 10 commandments, amongst 10 foundational principles up there with, don't worship other gods and don't murder, God says, I want you to set apart every seventh day to me. Now, there's a couple of things that God does here. He tells them to rest. He says, I don't want you to do any work. And as we pointed out, it's easy to get busy. It's hard, isn't it, to find time for God? So God commands mankind to take a break. And if you were to read in that section, the verse I skipped over on the screen, it was a break for the entire family, the parents, the children, the servants, any foreigners that lived among them. It even says the animals were to take a break. But if you look closely at this verse, you start to see that there's actually a purpose behind resting. It wasn't just about relaxation. It says they were to meditate on the fact that God delivered them from slavery in Egypt. You see, the day was a day of rest, but it was a day to meditate and reflect upon what God had done in their lives. And throughout the Sabbath day in the law, the Sabbaths would include activities where the Israelites would meet together, where they would worship and serve God in the tabernacle, or later in the temple. But by the time we come to the days of Jesus, the Jewish leaders had gone off track. They had turned the Sabbath into a complex set of rules and regulations. And unfortunately, because they misinterpreted the principle of the Sabbath, they end up hating Jesus because of what he did. And there's so many contentions and conflicts on the Sabbath day that it's hard to choose which ones to look at. But there's another fascinating one in John chapter 9. And John chapter 9, and what this slide depicts, is the healing of a blind man. So Jesus encounters another man. This is a man who was born blind. So he was a boy who could never see, who grew up into manhood without ever being able to see. No one could help him, no one could heal him, until it is that Jesus came along that one day. And he heals him in the most interesting of ways. Jesus takes his saliva and mixes it with the dust of the ground, and he smears it on the man's eyes, and he tells him to go and wash his eyes in the pool of Siloam. And I can just imagine this man, very bewildered, stumbling off to find the pool of Siloam. And when he washes off the clay, he can miraculously see for the first time in his life. And again, imagine the joy when he comes back and announces that he can see. And it would have been apparent to everyone as he came running back, something he would have never been able to do before because he would have tripped or fallen. But here's a man confidently coming back with his vision. But there's a problem. And you guessed it, it was the Sabbath day when Jesus healed this man. And so there's an awful lot to this story, and the Jewish leaders are not happy. But here's the conundrum that they faced. And this is kind of a conversation that goes on between the Pharisees and others that are there, or perhaps even between the Pharisees themselves. So some of them looked at Jesus and said, okay, this man is a criminal. There's no way he can be from God because he breaks the Sabbath. He must be a sinner. We cannot accept him. And yet others saw the exact same things that he did, and they said, man, how can he possibly be a sinner like the others are saying? He does these amazing miracles, and by implication, they're saying that he's from God. And the reason they got mixed up with Jesus and what he did is because they totally misunderstood the principles of the law. If they had only understood the Old Testament, kind of like what we're going through in our webinar series, if we can understand the Old Testament, then we can understand the things that take place in the New. If they had understood the Old Testament principle of the Sabbath, then I don't think they would have rejected and killed the Messiah that had come to save them. So let's stop and summarize just the two approaches that we've seen to the Sabbath that were existent in the first century when Jesus was there with the Pharisees. So first we have the view of Jesus, that the Sabbath was for man. It wasn't a set of rules and regulations that not even a trained rabbi could understand. It was a teaching tool. It was made for men to stop and think and reflect on the things of God. It was given to man as time to serve God. Jesus said, it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. That was one of his answers to the Pharisees. He said, well, how can it be wrong to help someone or to save someone's life? If that becomes sinful, then these Jewish rules that we can't find in the Old Testament are wrong. And finally, he also told the Pharisees, my Father works, and so do I. And I think this phrase really sums up Jesus' understanding the best. The Sabbath, like any day, was a day to do the work of God. If God set apart a special day to think and serve and think about God, then why would doing God's will on that day be a sin? And he pointed out this to the Jews, saying that the priests even worked on the Sabbath in offering the sacrifices. And sometimes they worked extra hard because there were special sacrifices on the Sabbath day. But on the other hand, the Pharisees put up barriers. When they saw a man who was healed on the day, they said, it's unlawful to carry your bed. You're breaking the law. They determined that Jesus wasn't the Messiah because he healed on the Sabbath. And one of their answers to Jesus and to the people when Jesus was healing is they actually told the people and said, look, you can come to Jesus and be healed 6 days of the week, but don't come on the Sabbath. That's God's day. And you can just see the irony in that statement and their conclusions. Now you might ask, well, how did two such different views of the Sabbath come from the same Old Testament scriptures? Well, the reality is that Jesus knew and understood the entire Old Testament. We've seen Jesus over and over again take his teaching and his principles from the books of the Old Testament. He didn't base his interpretation on the intellectuals or the rabbis that relied on their own traditions. Jesus knew and understood passages from the Old Testament. And one of the passages he would have known well, one of these passages that really explain the principle of the Sabbath, comes from the Old Testament book of Isaiah. Look what it says in Isaiah. I think it's worth reading this entire verse. If you turn back your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, and the holy day of the Lord honorable, if you honor it, not going about your own ways or seeking your own pleasure, or talking idly, then you shall take delight in the Lord. And so once again, you can see how Jesus would have understood this Old Testament context. When Jesus came and said he was Lord of the Sabbath, he wasn't changing the principles. He wasn't changing the law of Moses. He didn't come to destroy the law of Moses. He came to fulfill it, to illuminate the principles that God was establishing. And it's clear from the rest of the New Testament that this was a hard thing for the Jews to let go of. Even believing Jews found it hard to let go of the rules and regulations that they were taught from their youth. They found it hard to not go back to the rules of circumcision and Sabbath keeping. And so in the epistles, we have several passages where Paul and the other apostles explain to us what Jesus was trying to teach on holy days. And I want to just finish off with this one last verse from the book of Romans. And I think it's very helpful to understand the principle. This is what Jesus was trying to teach, and he got it from the Old Testament. It says, one person esteems one day better than another. Well, another esteems all days alike. And we know that there's some that say this day is special and this isn't. But here's the point. It says, the one who observes the day observes it in honor of the Lord. So if you want to take a day and do something special, do it for God. Do it to honor God in the things that you think about, the things that you read, the things that you do. It says the one who eats, because there was arguments about what you could eat, eats in honor of the Lord. Do it for God, since he gives thanks to God. Well, the one who abstains, perhaps from food specifically, but in the context, one who doesn't keep a day holy, well, they should do it in honor of God. And so the point is that we should serve God every day. The Sabbath principle throughout the Bible is to rest from our own works and do the will of God. And you know what? That's something that can be done any day, and something that really should be done every day.